I'm glad to see all of you. My name is Mika Vandersal, and I am the principal here at Vandersal Collective, and very happy to be accompanied with Erin Weber Johnson, one of our consultants, and Ashley Goff, who is one of our clients and friends in Arlington, Virginia, First Presbyterian Church of Arlington. I'll speak a little bit about what we're doing here today and who we are, and Erin will then move us into strategic filters. What are they? How do they happen? And then we'll hear from Ashley in her context in particular and have that conversation. We'll do a sample and have fun together, and then we'll go to the questions and answers. So first, by way of introduction, Vandersal Collective offers a human approach to reaching people, raising money, and reimagining the future. We're here for congregations and nonprofits as they face the challenges of communicating, fundraising, and visioning strategic work for a new area. We provide hands-on support with writing, design, social media, websites, fundraising, or far-reaching discernment of one's mission and purpose in the world. And we work by listening, dreaming, and making things real. We work mostly with progressive congregations and religious organizations, as well as secular nonprofits. So while we can engage in traditional strategic planning with the best of them, we have seen far too many clients work really, really hard on creating plans, and then life happens. Traditional models have us planning and then executing and then planning, but that isn't how organizational cycles work. If COVID has taught us anything, it has shown us that really, truly, we are actually not in control. Every few months, we might think we're onto something, a bit more predictable, a bit more clear, the end being in sight, and now we are in year 3. So we know well that that is not the case, actually. We don't know what's coming, and not only because of COVID, but well-laid plans are interrupted by sickness, by social movements and cries for justice, by fatigue, by grief, and by incredible opportunities for impact and for services, for impact and for service and for beauty that are found in the cracks in these moments. So we found that the base beginning of any strategic kind of work is to know who one is, to know the personality of an organization or congregation that makes you up, for the ways that we do things, the ways that we express ourselves, the ways that we serve. From this personality, we can then articulate our core values. And as we do the work we're called to engage in together, what is it we value most collectively as a group? To be able to articulate these things is not an easy task, and yet it's really fun and really joyful when you have someone else bring you through the process to do so. We not only do this for our clients, but we've had others do it for us as well. It's both, it's important to be on both sides of the equation. So then from this articulation, from the core of who you are, your purpose, clear as a whistle, we create a filter to be used for decision-making. As I said, Erin will talk about this next. When done right, the filter becomes the third party, the outside living document that organizations come back to again and again for all decision-making. It isn't about making plans, trying to execute and then make plans again, but instead is about more of an action reflection model. We found the resource, A Nonprofit Revolution by La Piana, to be very helpful in the creation of this work that we offer. And from that book, I am going to show you an exhibit that visually shows the difference between these two approaches. So here we have a traditional planning model, like I said, of the planning, the implementing and execution, and that's the planning. But again, life takes over. Instead, we engage more in this kind of model of the thinking and implementing, being able to move back and forth based on the external environmental circumstances, and coupled with strategy formation as well. This might be a helpful visual to have as you understand what we're getting to as we think about strategic planning, strategic filter, strategic thinking. So one note, due to circumstances out of our control, there has been a shift a bit in our guest lineup today. As I mentioned, we have here the amazing Ashley Goff to talk with us from Arlington Presbyterian Church. Others were to be here, but travel happens in the United States, and often that is not fun. So Erin also comes to us as the lead consultant in the creation of the strategic filter that we did with Arlington Presbyterian Church, in addition to many other services. And so now I'll turn it over to Erin to talk about the process of how this has worked and what that looks like.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Erin Weber-Johnson, and I'm so delighted that you are here. Please note that after this meeting, there will be a follow-up email that will provide you not only with some links for information, but also copies of the recording today and the visuals that have been requested. What I'd like to begin in this moment is to tell just a very quick story about a client that I worked with about 6 years ago. It was right after the murder of Michael Brown in St. Louis. And I was working with a church at Holy Communion Episcopal Church in St. Louis, which is outside of Ferguson. And it's a church that was half made up of people that would identify as people of color and half made up of people that would identify as white. And we were faced with a number of different real-time issues. Given what had happened to Michael Brown, there was lots of conversation about how is this church going to show up? And what they found was that half of the church wanted to have a Black Lives Matter sign up, and half of the church did not. The half that wanted it up at that point were the folks that would identify as white, and the folks that did not, at that point, they changed their mind later, would identify as people of color. Well, this presented a lot of conversation. And what they found was that they needed not a plan, but a process, a methodology for making real-time decisions together. And it was through this process of making real-time decisions together that they identified their core values. And we're able to have some very clear conversations. One of the core values was diversity. They identified that diversity was something that they held to be true together, to them. But diversity for some meant advocacy, and for others meant inclusion and belonging. And so together, having these important conversations, they were able to move forward and make decisions based on their core values. It meant digging deep into who they were so that their expressions would match what they held to be true. Now, how do we get to that point? Well, what we find is that the product is only as good as the process itself. And Mika is quite right about the fact that this process can look a little different for each client. We recognize that each one of you that are watching this video have variables that are unique, that there's denominational videos or denominational characteristics, there are generational characteristics, there's a whole host of different ways in which your congregation is different from others. And so when thinking about this process, van der Sal begins with understanding the context. So thinking about what communications work, what communications don't. I know that many of you found that out during COVID. What were the ways in which talking to one another works? And where were there gaps in how conversation continued? And in thinking about that, also, we think about what is the language of invitation that we invite people into the process that can be heard. For some, these questions of what does it mean to be authentically us need to be framed in a way that they feel included in the process, that they feel specially invited into it. Many have been excluded for so long, they need a special invitation. So we work with your context, knowing who you are, spending some time asking you questions about who you are, to create a listening process. And we also then have a set of questions that are designed to get to the core values of who you are. These questions are not programmatic evaluation questions. They are not like, what is working well in your church? These are not questions of imagine your church in 5 to 10 years, right? These are not the typical strategic planning or appreciative inquiry, which have their place and are wonderful tools. But this is its own separate process, which requires separate questions. It's also, as I mentioned, rooted in context. And because it's rooted in context, we also think about, okay, how do we invite people into the questions? For example, some of you might have commuter churches where people are not of the neighborhood, right? But have to travel a long ways to get there. We would take that into account. Some of you might have a significant number of extroverts amidst your groups and require a lot of verbal processing. Or you might have introverts that maybe require more internal processing. We take all of that into account so that the process could look like a series of retreats, series of interviews, a number of after church sessions or surveys. We like to engage in multiple ways with the culture to allow for multiple access points. This is because we don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all mentality. Rather, there's a way to do this that fits you, and that's what we strive for. Once we have asked these questions and invited responses, then we engage in what's called qualitative analysis. Qualitative analysis is something that Mika and I very much value in our work, in that we apply a pretty consistent methodology to the work that we do. And it's because of our experience in this that we are able to identify not just themes, but also able to use some methodology around cross-tabulation, et cetera, to look to see what is emerging across all of the information. And we engage also in a time of reflection back with your leadership to make sure that what we are seeing in the themes resonates. Then, as the themes emerge, we have core values. These core values become centered to your language around decision making. But in the case of Holy Communion, as you heard me discuss, sometimes a single word can have lots of different definitions. We might have our own narratives even attached to definitions. And this is where this absolutely becomes a collective, collaborative decision-making process, in that it takes a group in order to create definitions that are contextual to you all. So for example, an organization that talks about justice might have a very different definition if it is specifically an LGBTQ justice oriented, whereas if it's an organization that is specifically looking at food deserts, right? The two might have overlapping themes, but there might be particular nuances according to your context. After we create very clear definitions around each core value and root that in the sources of wisdom for the community, and we believe in taking the full range of sources of authority, according to you all, then we create a filter. Now we're going to show you in a moment parts of that filter, but it's a bit of an extensive list of questions that include best practices in the field around IRS regulations, as well as then rooting this in your core values. Here's the thing though, this is not a strategic plan where we come out of this with like this awesome rubric, this awesome filter, and then, you hang it up, and then like once a year you refer to it to see if like you're meeting your goals. This isn't even like a quarterly benchmark review process. Rather, the filter is used regularly by your leadership boards, by your committees, your subcommittees. It's published broadly so that your core values are rooted in your liturgy, are rooted in your life together, so that people become very aware of how decisions are made in a very transparent way. Why do we do this? Because oftentimes we hear people ask, well, I don't know how that decision was made. Or sometimes in the moment of conflict, we see that decisions are made because of some sort of emotional connection or relational connection. This allows for a transparent, clear process. Finally, then, because this is a real-time practice, we then come back after we've done that work and train your leadership on how to do this. We come with scenarios and we practice together how discussions would look using the filter. And then we invite you to continue using that filter regularly, so that as real-time decisions are made, this work continues to be core to who you are. So with that in mind, Mika, I want to turn it back to you. I know that we have walked through a bit about this, but I'd love to hear a bit from one of our clients.
Ashley, as we're getting started here, can you just tell us a little bit about your context? What is Arlington, Virginia like? What, you know, in addition to that, what's part of your story that got you to identify that you needed to articulate your core values?
Mm-hmm. So I'm Ashley Goff. Thank you, Mika and Aaron. I'm Ashley Goff, and I'm the pastor at Arlington Presbyterian Church in Arlington, Virginia. And in 2016, Arlington Presbyterian Church sold the land it was on and its building to Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, APA. APA is a nonprofit developer for affordable housing. And this decision, this call to sell the land it was on in its building to APA came from like a 10-year discernment process about the congregation really digging into, you know, who are we, particularly to our neighbors, most importantly. We've got this building, this is our biggest asset. What do we do? And it's probably around 2014. I always say, since I got here in 2018, that as the story's been told to me, as the story goes, they used a lot of discernment practices, the congregation did. But one thing that they did that always sticks with me is that they went out into the neighborhood and started talking to neighbors, right? They rode the buses, they put the card table out on Saturday morning with the donuts. They walked up and down Columbia Pike, which is one of the main commercial drags in Arlington County, which is where the church was located. And they just asked people, I mean, basically got down to, you know, how are things for you in Arlington County? What changes are you noticing? You know, what's up? And the common denominator in all the stories were that I can't afford to live and work in Arlington County, and I want to do both. I want to live here and I want to work here. Mm-hmm. And so that really, what they'll say is broke their hearts. And that really fueled, among all these other practices that they had been doing, to do something big, large scale around affordable housing. So that's when in 2016, they sold the land, they sold the building and the land they were on to APA for $8.5 million. APA came in, demolished the building, and created Gilliam Place, which is a 173 unit affordable housing apartment building. So our office, our worship space is on the entry level of Gilliam Place. So I am in the apartment building. Above me are, 500 or so of our neighbors. This is an intergenerational building. And to get into the building, you need to be making 60% of the average median income in Arlington County. In Arlington County, that's around $120,000 right now. The zip code we are in, 22204, is the most representational zip code in Arlington County across the board, race, ethnicity, and class. And so this neighborhood, well, everybody in Arlington County needs affordable housing, but this would make a high impact in the zip code to create Gilliam Place. So I got here in 2018, and we got into Gilliam Place in our new space that we created. We've got about 3,000 square feet in here. We do own 12,000 square feet of green space that ended up not being used for the creation of the building. And so the church bought that land back from APA for $850,000. So that was considered a tithe back to the neighborhood. So that's just green space. Come and sit and rest your weary soul in our Adirondack chairs. So we got in in November 2019 into our new space. So we were here still trying to figure out where the light switches were, and COVID hit. And so like everybody else, we went virtual in March 2020. So then in May, right, when we all kind of realized this isn't going anywhere and people are losing their jobs and rent is becoming increasingly difficult to make, we start hearing that people need $200, $500, $1,000 to make their rent. In the meantime, we have $6.5 million sitting in the New Covenant funds in the Presbyterian Foundation. So for me, that gap, that scale of what was happening in people's lives, and then the amount of wealth that we have, was that space in between.
Yeah.
Personally, was killing me.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a real struggle with the money anyway. Not that I wanted to get rid of the money, because you can do a lot of amazing things with money. But what we were saying about the money and the way we were acting and behaving and making choices around the money, again, big gap. So for me, that gap is my confusion. It's my anger. It's my, lack of focus.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had met Mika at a Next Church conference right before the pandemic hit. And so the suggestion came, let's explore working with Vandersall to work on our money story, to create a relationship with our money. Right. At that point, the budget owned the money. Our freaking budget had power over the money. Those little Excel spreadsheet doc things owned the money. So anything that had the neighborhood, the community, even us, it wasn't that wasn't driving the story of the money. So we started working with Vandersall, and we had a retreat, which came down to the question of who owns the money, whose money, I shouldn't say that, whose money is it? We had a lot to say about that, but really when it came down to it, the ethic wasn't there. So in that spring then, 21, that's when we started working on our strategic filter. And that's when we started working on our core values. So one of our questions, so we had 3 sessions after worship in the spring. And one question was, what makes you come alive at APC? And you had to tell a story, not an idea or a thought or a program. You had to tell your own story. And then I think the second question was around like what kind of change at APC you've seen in the last 10 years. Tell a story. And then our collective power comes from God. How do we want to build more collective power? Tell a story. And so from there, actually, one of our members does some of the work that Erin and Mika do. And she, coded, figured out the values, right? She extracted the values and the definitions. And so there now we have what we call a strategic filter. So we run our decisions from the smallest to the biggest, not everyone, but ones that we feel like we really want to tend to through the filter. And I will say before, hand it back to you, Mika, that, and Erin, you alluded to this, right? The gap, right? We do incarnational work. And if there's a gap, that disfigures the body. It disfigures the work of the incarnation. So the more the internal and the external line up, the greater the sense of incarnation. And for me as a leader, this has extended my longevity at APC and honestly working in the church in general, because we're not in meetings where the personalities reign. We are in values-based conversations. And now there is a tool that can create equity in the room, right? So if you've been at APC for 3 months or 30 years, you have access to the values. And so it just creates much different conversation, and it diffuses the room, honestly. Like we can have conversations about money, not that there isn't tension or, we don't go back and forth or something like that, but it is structure. And if there's anything we need right now, it is structure. And so it really structures a conversation in a way, rather than just who's the smartest person in the room about money, who knows the budget the best, who can run the Excel spreadsheet. There's just, it's a much different way of relating to each other. And so since our work is so relational, that's one of our values. The alignment is there.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashley.
Right.
Erin, what do you, as the consultant on this, the lead consultant on this process, what do you think it was that made Arlington Presbyterian ready for engaging in a strategic filter process?
So I think that clients in general, I'll speak to general and then in specificity. I think clients are ready for this when they are able to acknowledge as a leadership body that they need a common language and a common decision-making process. If there's a collective desire, not towards creating a structure for one person to have authority, but for a collective ownership together to engage, I think that that's when we know that this process can be successful. I think also there needs to be a willingness to listen, which I know that many people are at that spot, right? We're asking, what does church look like now, right? We want to listen, right? So I think that's why this moment is really calling for this type of work, is because we are trying to see, okay, what are the core values that held true specifically to communities and organizations through the pandemic, even though the expressions of those identities may have changed or adapted. Now, what was unique specifically to Ashley and her context? Well, first of all, y'all can just saw the depth and the significant leadership that Ashley brought, which I think is important. I think that there was also a real, I would name it as a humility that people brought to this work, saying, we are ready to learn together, and a curiosity that I think is you heard part of the story that was reflected in 2014, where they sought to hear from a place of curiosity what broke the hearts of the neighborhood. And I think they brought that same sense of curiosity to this work, which I really admire and appreciate.
Yeah, thanks. I want to encourage all of you who are listening to be thinking about your questions. Soon we'll have some time to open it up to questions from the rest of you as well. So jot those down as we move through the conversation. Ashley, can you give us an example? You talked a little bit about money in the spreadsheet and where, who owns it. But can you give us a concrete example of how you've used the filter for a tough decision?
Yeah. Well, I think the first two that come to mind, they're quite different, is our budget for 2022. So in previous scenarios, the budget had three people. You looked at the previous budget, we looked at what we are getting in stewardship pledges, and then you just start plugging the numbers, right? And it's kind of the scarcity driven model of a budget, right? Like everyone's kind of grabbing for the last dime. This time, again, we used Vandersall to help us create the budget, because you get the filter and you're not done. Okay. I would even wonder if we're even ready, 3 years after 3 budgets, this will be our third budget with Vandersall. Are we ready to do this on our own? Because it needs discipline and practice. But what we did in working with Erin was realize that if our budget is for the neighbor, if our money is for the neighbor, if that is our mantra, that is why we exist. We do not exist if we do not, love self and love neighbor. Then we should go talk to the damn neighbors about what's going on in the neighborhood. So Erin helped us come up with a set of questions that were asset driven. Okay, so when an affordable housing apartment building comes into a neighborhood, it is deficit driven, right? It is people are going to take low-income people are going to take my parking spot. They're going to take the spot in the school for my unborn child, okay, their seat that I've already claimed. And they're going to take the glimmer of sky that I've been looking at for the past 30 years out of my house. Okay, so those are all real emotional things. And they're not the final say on the neighborhood, right? It's a very colonized approach to things. So so we wanted to look at the assets. What are the assets? What are the gifts in the neighborhood? What are we bringing to the table? What do you want to do together? And so from there, those stories set the priorities for the budget. So, so we talked to maybe 10 or 12 neighbors. So we talked to the neighbors, shared the stories with Session, that was our governing body in the Presbyterian Church, because it was a different group of people doing the budget, right? It wasn't Session. And then we ran the budget. So then, some of the initial numbers got in. Yes, eventually we do have to have a spreadsheet because we have to have accounting practices. So, but we ran the budget through the strategic filter. So do we see, is this budget justice focused? Is it practicing transformation? Is it relational? Is it inclusive? Are we praying for the budget? Are we seeing what we need to let go of in the budget and what we need to embrace? And then the numbers, then we, finalize the numbers. So the numbers actually came last. And the numbers then just fell into place. And honestly, the lack of tension and stress over the numbers at that point, I mean, people weren't like, whatever, just put a number in. But there was so much trust in the room, in the Zoom room. There was so much confidence in our process. There was trust in the values, right? This is all the incarnational work. So, and so, we run the budget, and then, so now we have this budget, and then Mika, cue up the illustration. So, friends, because not all of us look at numbers, and love them. I mean, I love numbers, but what we did have, we had actually a church member who's an illustrator. She created this illustration of our budget. So this is us. This is our Gilliam Place ecosystem. That's how we see ourselves, right? This is the body. And so the biggest blue, the place-based, right? That's where the biggest chunk of money goes. There's communal, it's justice focused, it's relational, inclusive. The other values are there. These are just these are the primary ones that we saw in the budget. So this is another teaching tool. We're actually using it right now as we talk about our own infrastructure, and we need to get our own internal organizational ways in place. I blew this up into a poster size. So this is, this is another way of us looking at our budget rather than just, 4 minus 2 is 2.
Great. Awesome.
Yeah. Then the second one is we have a garden, and we have a little garden team, and they were talking, things that happen in the garden, things that we need to make decisions about in the garden. So really, in the past month, we had, we didn't really use the filter, we just used the values, but we had a conversation. Is the garden justice focused? Is it a place of transformation? Where is relational work showing up, right? And so it really came down to, hey, if there's things we want to do in the garden, we need to go sit down in the garden and talk to people who are using the garden, right? That's the backyard for the apartment building, basically. So it holds us accountable to what we say we want to do and we want to be. So there's different ways of, so that we didn't specifically use the filter, but we use the values as a way of having conversation. And I've told the story to Mika and Aaron. What it does is you learn things about people that you might always know if you're just talking about logistics, right? So I learned that one of our members in this conversation created a garden full of radishes as a kid, because her dad loved radishes and she wanted to have a connection with her dad. So she grew a garden full of freaking radishes, and she would pick them and clean them and take them to her dad. Maybe I would have known that in some other context, but the conversation with the values brought that story out of this person. And that creates empathy, that creates compassion, and it creates connection. And so, lots of stuff happening. And so it's, Aaron and Mika and I mentioned this before coming on here, that we have a lot of wealth here at APC. We've got land wealth and we have money wealth. And just because we have all these things doesn't mean it isn't we have different conversations than if you don't have money, but it's still difficult. And and I'll say this too, don't do this on your own. You're going to get annihilated. Okay. As a leader, you're just going to get annihilated. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashley.
But what
That
it
was
does,
wonderful.
it creates leaders in the room, right? I'm just facilitating this conversation, or someone else is, but
Yeah.
everyone's got a chance. Everyone's got a spot to say something. So it's a collective thing, and it doesn't focus on one person.
Yeah. Thanks.
That was beautiful.
So I see the questions coming in. That's great. We're going to move on to a sample question, and then we'll do the question and answer after that. So Erin, I turn it to you, but I shared my screen.
So when you think about a filter, you're probably thinking to yourself, what is this? This feels very theoretical. I can tell you that the filter that we create together tends to be a Google Doc that can be filled out in real time amongst different committee members, et cetera. And it's pretty long. And so we're not going to show you the entire thing, but we did want to give you a taste, not just to hear us talking and extolling the praises of this concept, but for you to actually see it in real time in a miniature way. So what you're going to see here, it does not include questions that we would normally include around like volunteer capacity, financial capacity, redundancy, several others that are important. But rather today we're going to look at a few of the core values of a organization that is real, but will go unnamed, and see how they align with this potential fun scenario. Now, lest you think that we just came up with this scenario, I want you to know that this scenario happened to me and a client that I was working with in 2016. So this really happened. And I know, especially for those of you in the New York area, filming is often something that you come across. So I'm going to read it real quick. Picture this for your organization. A movie production company comes to your faith community with an opportunity. I have an opportunity. They need a staging area for a film being produced locally by a conservative evangelical group for the purposes of evangelism. Their film, set during the apocalypse, is a sequel in a series of movies. They will pay $5,000 a day to the faith community for 2 to 3 days to use the woodsy area and the entire physical plant, including your sanctuary. They like that you have some green space, that they would have access to bathrooms, and that is close to the shoot. However, they would also need 2 volunteers to help out by opening up, monitoring things, and closing. And the days are super long, about 5:45 a.m. to 7 p.m. So what does your leadership decide to do about this? Now, keeping in mind, once again, we would normally have questions like, do we have volunteer capacity for this? Do we have financial capacity for this? Do we which are included. I want us to turn to now some sample core values. Communal. We desire connection and relationships with our community. We want to help, but also be helped. So keeping in mind that this would potentially be one of the core values. Second, vulnerable is a core value for this organization. We are here to be saved, not to do the saving. We need to prepare our hearts for this openness. And third, justice oriented.
Sorry, I was all in it. I was all in
You
it.
were
I'm thinking,
so in it.
really hard.
We'll come back. We'll come back.
What are you gonna do?
I know. This is quite the dilemma, isn't it? We believe in confronting the social and/or systemic sins of the world. Our actions, practices, and beliefs are shaped by a commitment to loving our neighbors in public, especially the poor, the vulnerable, and those carrying heavy burdens. We define this for our faith community as including the following aspects of our justice work: witness, prophetic, socially conscious, and active. All right, Mika, if you wouldn't mind turning back to the okay. Now, no, one more, to the green, thank you. What I'm going to ask is, this is just a sample conversation. Mika and Ashley, you are 2 of 12 people that would potentially be walking through this conversation together. And I want to ask the 2 of you, within this core value of communal, how do you see or do you see the core value of communal aligning with this opportunity around the movie production company? Is there alignment?
Can you go back to the scenario? Like, I'm
Sure.
yeah. Okay, thanks.
I mean, so to be 100% transparent, my theology nor Ashley's theology is conservative in evangelical. And I find conservative theology at times to be quite destructive and doing a lot of damage, especially as I come from a place of being queer in the church. That's been my experience. That doesn't mean that conservative evangelical people are not family members or wonderful people, but I struggle with the effects of that theology. Going back to the communal piece, then, like, I think the money can be used for communal work, but the activity of setting this up does not feel communal to me in any way, and feels taxing to these poor souls who are going to have to be there from 5:45 a.m. to 7 p.m. Even if we split up shifts. I don't want to be there at 7:45 a.m. I'm not interacting with my neighborhood very well or with great joy at 5:45 in the morning.
So William Kritzman in the chat would also agree with you that there doesn't appear to be alignment with communal. What do you say, Ashley?
Well, Erin, I know one thing in our filter is like, do we need more information?
Right.
I would be curious. I mean, I would be curious about the purposes of evangelism, about their evangelical, evangelism.
Yeah, what does that mean?
What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah.
I'm so curious about set during the apocalypse, what that looks like. But I don't think it, this feels very transactional, right? Yep. I mean, I can see it being I was in a church where before APC, where we had the Wedding Crashers was filmed at our church, and it's an easy money grab. It's very alluring. I mean, we did it. And so this is a very transactional situation for me. So it really doesn't, it's not engaging the neighborhood. Like, ultimately, is it what community is being built and who's the community being built for?
Yep.
Ultimately being built, I mean, the community that they want to build is a community that, right, for the purposes of evangelizing. And do we want to be part of that? Do we want our story to be in that story? And ultimately, what community is being created? That would be, even the woodsy area, right? Like that's an experience, that's an ecosystem thing, that's a community thing, like all the whole, so that would be my question is, what community would be built in this? And and does it align with the community, the story that we are called by people of faith to build?
Mm-hmm. Let's move then to vulnerability. I
appreciate Erin putting them in the chat so that we don't have to.
Yeah, absolutely. If you'd like to, the core values are found in the chat.
Yeah.
Vulnerable. You have agreed on this core value with this definition. We are here to be saved, not to do the saving. We need to prepare our hearts for this openness. Do you find alignment here?
I go back to the transactional nature that Ashley's talking about. It feels transactional because we're not ministry partners with these folks, right? So if we were, then that might be a different kind of conversation. But I don't feel safe being vulnerable with those who would be on site.
Right. Yeah, I mean, APC is a more like Presbyterian church. And so who are the 2 to 3 volunteers that are, I'm straight. I'm not putting a queer person in that position, like who would be harmed, the vulnerability, yeah, like I would not, it would be very vulnerable for anyone, but but for queer people in our congregation to be put in this situation, not that they would be put there, but to be a volunteer. That's not the vulnerability we're talking about, right? Where you're setting up harm or the possibility of harm. So, and then if we're looking at this as kind of your, typical conservative evangelical theology, right? That is, there isn't mutuality. There isn't a real, that I don't see vulnerability in that, that there's a giving and a receiving. So.
And finally, justice-oriented. We believe in confronting the social and/or systemic sins of the world. Our actions, practices, and beliefs are shaped by a commitment to loving our neighbors in public, especially the poor, the vulnerable, and those carrying heavy burdens. It just gets more complicated and more nuanced. I love it.
Yeah.
So what does that mean in terms of alignment?
Well, I think about the profit that this film would make, right? You want to make something.
That's so funny. Ash, I'm sorry, Ashley, to totally interrupt you. I find it fascinating that you went to the profit, and look at my mind frame. I'm like, but it's $5,000. What could we do with $5,000? Like,
okay,
we're on a different.
Right? We could
really
transform it.
Okay,
transform that money.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can transform. What 2 or 3 days, $15,000.
Yeah,
I'll take your money and transform it. And then also, right, and then on the other side, the profit of this, if our money as people of faith is to heal and disrupt, right, to disrupt the ways of sin and hurt and harm. If this movie makes money or whatever it does, will that money make harm? Will it create harm? And we would be part of that, right? I mean, we're all entrenched in all the ways of harm. I mean, there's no way of totally extracting ourselves, but are we actually going to put ourselves in a position where money is going to do harm to people?
Yeah.
And so I think about that, and yes, Mika, $15,000. I mean, our money's not. We've got $7 million in the foundation. That's not great money. There's a history of that money, and our responsibility now with that money is to filter it through the ways of the faith. So it's anyway.
Yeah.
So what we hoped to demonstrate here together, what would typically happen with this is that then at the end of a longer conversation that would include those components around capacity, et cetera, you would be able to see very clearly where you have places where you need more information, where there tends to be some collective energy towards or against. But one of the things that I think is really important to note was that at no point did we say things that were related to like, we need to do this because X, Y, and Z is on the board, right? We didn't say like, I have a strong feeling against this, and so we shouldn't do it. Rather, we went from a place of, this is our value. This is who we say we are. So as we're thinking about alignment, it stopped being about the individual, and it became more of a collective, collaborative process as we continued into the conversation.
Great. Can I say something about?
Please.
I mean, so that's just so early church, right? That's it. That is the early church, that they were driven by their values. I mean, they were aspirational values, right? I mean, they weren't living all of them out, but this idea of, of sharing, of collectiveness, of giving what you have to your neighbor. And, so you can fall into these scenarios where you're like, well, let's get $15,000, because if we don't get it, we're not going to make our budget, and then we're all going to die.
That's right.
And that's not how the early church functioned. There was no guarantee of that church surviving, and they focused on their values.
Yeah. Thanks.
Preach it. Well, Mika, I think we have some questions.
Yep, we've got 2 questions. One coming in here from Doris. Good to see your name again, Doris. Their congregation just completed the Holy Cow CAT consulting tool, which Aaron and Ashley, do you know?
Yeah, we did that.
You probably know them as well. Yeah. So we definitely know the CAT and have worked with it, and find that. So the question, have you worked with a congregation fresh off of that? Yes, we have. It's helpful to have that information so clearly laid out, and the CAT we find really helps congregations know where they are, and the work that we do then can help congregations go to where they're going. So yes, we have, as far as the cost to do that work, Doris, I ask you be in touch with us. It's definitely more of a conversation, as you know, as we've talked about. There's not a one size fits all process for this, so it's based on a variety of factors. All right, Amauri, I saw that you gave us a question. What are practices governing leaders need to understand as essential as 1, strategic filters are developed, and 2, as strategic filters are implemented and used? What are practices that we need to understand?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes. So I spoke to this a little bit about, you might have to remind me the second part of the question, Mika. I spoke to this a little bit when we were talking about how do we know when clients are ready. But when thinking about practices, I think that there needs to be definitely a desire to learn together as a practice, a desire for curiosity. I know that at this point, many of you are tired. Let me own it. We're all tired. We're all holding a lot. And there's no but or and I'm going to include at the end of that. We're just holding a lot, and life feels a little bit relentless these days. And I want to name that. And so to gather that level of curiosity, man, that is a gift. And that is hard work. And I am not going to sugarcoat it. However, you all keep showing up, and I'm so grateful. Thank you. So when thinking about a second practice around curiosity, that leads us to, there needs to be also a desire for outside support.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get into situations where people, for a number of really important reasons, aren't able to trust outsiders. And that can be really complicated. But those are 3 really important practices. Oh, I remember the second part to the question, so I'm going to slide right on in. The second part of the question that you raised was around what are the practices then that need to continue once you have that filter in place. And this is a really important piece, which is that there needs to be a dedication and an affirmation of the hard work that has been done, so that you continue to use this filter regularly. This is not I'm going to take this and sit this on the wall or post it to the wall situation. This is a commitment to actively have these conversations regularly. It's also a commitment to be willing to change how some of these discussions have gone.
Yeah.
For example, I love a good consent agenda, right? For those of you who know what a consent agenda is, it means that you have a number of different items that you send out in advance of a leadership and say, okay, let's just get all of that out of the way and then come ready for consent. There are some conversations, though, that require this filter. And so sometimes there's ways in which efficiency or the desire for efficiency makes way to inefficiency, but most importantly, a lack of relational connection. So keeping in mind that this is a process that has to be readily engaged in regularly. Mika, did you have anything further to add, or Ashley?
I mean, that wonderful list of ways of white supremacy, that, efficiency is named as one of the tools and elements of sustaining white supremacy. So what this does is it slows it down. It slows the conversation down, not so it can be controlled, but so that various voices can be included in the conversation. And we can literally slow our brains down.
Yeah,
right.
So it's a different slowing down. It's not like slowing down so that we don't ever have to make a decision. It's like
slowing down your central nervous system, like a contemplative practice. So it's, and I think that's really important, right? Because some of this stuff is so anxiety driven, like money, property, possessions, right? We've got a lot invested in this stuff. And when you start extracting yourself, emotions come and you can get flooded with emotions. So this just really helps slow the body down, literally the body. And so I would agree with that, Erin, around efficiency.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you raised that. Thank you.
We've got to, bye Connie, she's got to run. But Dana, we have a question from you. Erin gave examples of what questions for determining filters are not. What are a few examples of what questions of what determining the filter would be? Yeah, I think that Ashley talked to that a little bit around when do you feel alive? Was that one of them? When do you feel most alive?
Where do you feel alive at? Where do you feel alive at APC? Something that elicits a story.
Right.
You know, not just do you agree with this or not? Like in a binary. There's no binary questions.
Right.
There's also that amazing collective power question about our collective power comes from God.
Yeah.
And then
the second one was something. It was around like change at APC. Or an organization that you've been part of if you're new to APC. But that was actually really helpful for me because people were like, oh, we're much more nimble now. So for me, that would, you know, I wasn't here 10 years ago. It was really helpful to see a trajectory and that people wanted to be on this trajectory.
Right. Another congregation that asked questions around where, what opportunities has the Holy Spirit given us that we've missed or something like that. That was really interesting.
The stories are lovely.
Yeah, it was really cool. So, all right, it is 2 minutes till. I am not seeing other questions.
Come on, one more question.
One more, come on, yo, come on. And Connie just said she had to go. So if we have one more question, or
Brett, you got a question? I'm just gonna call people out.
Yeah.
Laura, you got a question? Megan?
I have a question.
Okay.
Oh, how to sell to our leadership? Wow, that was not my question, but wow.
Dana. Okay, Dana.
Thanks, Dana. How do you sell it to your leadership? Well, actually, that is kind of connected to my question, which my question was going to be, why is this the moment for this work, right? So Dana, maybe you and I were on the same page. So here's why this is the moment. You know, as Mika talked about, right, like strategic planning is important when you're thinking about long-term visioning, right? It's good to have an idea of where you hope to be in 5 to 10 years. But for those of us that are in the midst of saying, oh, but I don't even know what the next right step is, right? I am so overwhelmed by all the different things that could be happening, right? There's a way in which we want to be authentically ourselves, and we want to be the people that God is calling us to be and to do. And we need a process, a collective one that breaks down the systemic inequity that we come oftentimes with, especially I, as a white person, I come with. We need a process that allows us together to make a collaborative decision in real time. This is not like a once every 3 or 4 year process. This is something that you engage in regularly. It's a tool that the leadership will be able to draw upon for years to come.
Yeah, that's it.
I would say, like, you know, it brings relief.
Yeah.
The first time, even in our scenarios that we did the first time with our session,
like the made up scenarios,
made up ones. Like people were like, oh, thank God. I mean, it was such a relief to be held by something other than your own tension or the past, or you don't want to screw up a decision, you know. And I was very thankful for that there is relief in something very practical to guide us. So we can say we want to pray over the budget, right? And yes, the words should be there and the silence should be there. And this is a very prayerful way of being all the time. And so there's just relief when, you know, it's just a volatile world that's not going anywhere. And to be a place, right? The early church was a place of creativity and real sanctuary and freedom. And this creates that type of space. So,
well, it's been wonderful being with you all. I'm putting my email address in the chat. Hopefully we can connect continue to connect further. Any questions or thoughts, or want to bring this to your own particular context, we're happy to have that conversation. This is the work we love to do. So thank you to Ashley, thank you to Erin, and we look forward to further conversation, and blessings on your work and all that we're carrying these days. Thank you all.